think they're working in communities that are kind of poor, so this is a good economic opportunity for the field educators. But I think there is a lot of pride in doing the job. So I think the time that we invest in our IPC workers and training them was one of my takeaways.
How much does it cost per woman converted to a modern method or any other metric that they use?
It was what, $19 per person?
I think it was more than
But per person visited.
per person visited, right?
Per like all people.
So if you're visiting 1 million women, yeah, so that's not per woman converting, that's per person visited. So it's not the cheapest model. Any other thoughts on what would work, what wouldn't?
Well, I was interested in the intensity of the follow-up and the frequency of the follow-up. I mean, that's pretty intense. And it sounds like you were saying, I don't know what our discontinuity rates are, or if we have measures of that, but.
We do, and I can share the evaluation with you. And I think continuation rates, if I remember offhand, they're about 77% in the project areas, which compared to 60% nationwide in Turkey. So they are, I mean, there's a higher continuation rate, still lower than we would hope, but it's higher than nationwide.
I feel like it would be fairly, well, not easy, but easier to implement in a highly populated area. But when you talk about rural areas, how do you translate that kind of intensity and follow-up?
And in fact, they are implementing it in Ghana. And one of the things that they're doing, I think they've just finished baseline, and they're starting to implement in Ghana. But 150 cards per average worker a week just isn't going to happen in a rural area. So I think there's a significantly lower number there.
And higher costs, transportation costs.
Yeah. Corinne?
I was just going to comment that in comparison to some of our project areas, the IPC workers have to be highly literate to fill out all of these forms and keep track of them.
That was actually another comment that came up, and I think, you know, one of the things, we had groups from Uganda and other places that went back, and they're like, how can we make this, obviously the way it's being done for Willows depends on a high level of literacy, but if we're going to use women from these very poor, underserved communities, we're not going to have a high level of literacy. So how can we have a system that you know, somebody with low literacy can follow? Obviously these forms that we have here aren't going to work.
Yeah, I mean, these women, they prefer them to have graduated from high school, if not then middle school. And like in some exceptions, they'll do elementary school if they can, you know, if they can read well enough. So.
Right. So that, I mean, that's an issue that was identified by our group too. Donna?
Can you talk a little bit, you talked a little bit about selection criteria, but what were some of the other elements of selection? Because when I think about, again, situations where we work, what I see most often is the people that are doing the IPC work are the ones that are most available, they're the ones that are most idle.
Right. Well, there is a certain amount of idleness, and I think, you know, in part, they're going into lower income communities, so there is high unemployment. So you do have a captive audience, most of whom have graduated from high school. But the impression we got, it's a very stringent selective process that goes on over several days, like a week where they're invited in and they're observed. And I think it's just a small proportion of them. I mean, it's a 1 week. They actually do, I think they explain it like a training, and they really closely observe people. And it's not just anybody who's available. It's a pretty small number that they actually select.
What's the MIS like? How complex?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, this is the heart of it, but they're entering everything into a computer system, and we are waiting. We don't have forms from them yet, but everything is sent on a weekly basis to headquarters, who also overviews and helps prioritize. Right. So there is some prioritizing that's also done by the system. But something, I mean, we asked ourselves, not necessarily something we couldn't do, because it's an area where we're scaling up in a lot of countries. Other thoughts?
Well, related to that, I mean, I think you said it was a 4-page sort of intake form when we first bought it. I don't know how that's all sort of computerized or something.
Yeah.
And then the other question I had was, you know, going out and surveying every household, you obviously have to have the political support for doing that, or you know, it can be contentious.
Yeah, we asked about that, especially, you know, in a Muslim country. And there are very conservative areas still in Turkey, and I think there was a lot of, community mobilization behind the scenes before I knew this happened. They have a 3-week training before they actually go out and do the baseline. And I think it's project officers also meeting with key community officials to get buy-in for this. So there is a lot of work in getting certain key leaders on. I mean, if you think of just knocking on somebody's door and asking them to speak about family planning. It's interesting that in Turkey, the men aren't really targeted. In Ghana, they are part of the target audience. For obvious reasons, they need to be. In Ghana and Turkey, it was found that the women had their support